esteem. Let's start here because this is where most people lose their peace long before anything else happens. The endless explaining, the over-talking, esteem, the rehearsing conversations in your head at 2 a.m., thinking, if I can just say it the right way, maybe this time they'll understand me. That belief alone can keep you trapped for years. Esteem. And I want to say this gently, but clearly with a narcissistic person, the problem is not that you haven't explained yourself well enough. Esteem. The problem is that they are not invested in understanding you at all. Many people come into these relationships assuming good faith. That's normal. That's healthy. Esteem, you assume that if someone hurts you and you calmly explain how and why, they'll care, they'll reflect, they'll maybe even change. Esteem. That assumption works in emotionally reciprocal relationships. It does not work here. A narcissistic person is not sitting across from you thinking, esteem. Let me really hear their experience. They're thinking, how does this affect me? How do I maintain control? How do I avoid accountability? So every explanation you offer becomes material. Esteem. Not for empathy, but for manipulation. They gather your words, your vulnerabilities, your emotional logic, and they store it away. Later, it shows up as gaslighting, as minimization, esteem, as mockery, or as a sudden dramatic reversal wherever they become the wounded one, and you're left apologizing for being hurt in the first place. That's not misunderstanding, that's dismissal, esteem. And yet, you keep trying, because you're human, because clarity feels like safety, because you believe communication is the solution. You think, if I can just make them see my heart, esteem, they'll stop hurting it. But here's the hard truth. The more you try to be understood by someone who lacks empathy, the more you hand them access to your inner world, esteem. And that access is exactly what disrupts your peace. You start to second-guess yourself. You replay conversations wondering if you were too emotional, too blunt, too sensitive, too quiet, esteem. You start editing yourself in real time. You start shrinking. And over time, the relationship doesn't just drain your energy, it erodes your self-trust. You're no longer asking, esteem, is this treatment okay? You're asking, did I explain it badly? That shift is devastating. Peace begins when you stop auditioning for understanding, esteem. When you stop presenting your pain like evidence in a courtroom, hoping for a fair verdict. A narcissistic person is not an impartial judge. They are not listening to rule in truth, esteem. They're listening to win. And you cannot win an argument where the other person refuses the basic premise that your feelings matter. This is why people often say, but when they're calm, esteem, they seem to get it, or they apologized once, or they admitted it for a moment. Those moments can feel intoxicating. They feel like proof that if you just hang in there, esteem, empathy is possible. But fleeting insight is not the same as sustained accountability. Understanding that only appears when it benefits them is not real understanding. It's strategic esteem. When you stop trying to be understood, something radical happens. You reclaim mental space. You stop feeding the cycle of hope and disappointment. You stop confusing clarity with connection, esteem. And most importantly, you stop measuring your worth by their response. You no longer need them to agree with your reality in order for it to be real. This doesn't mean you stop speaking, esteem. It means you stop over-explaining. You stop defending basic needs. You stop offering TED Talks about why respect matters. You state things once calmly, briefly, esteem, and without emotional overinvestment, and then you observe, not to judge them, but to gather information for yourself. How do they respond when you're clear and contained? Do they respect it, esteem? Do they mock it? Do they escalate? That information is far more valuable than any apology you might extract. A lot of people worry that stopping explanations means being cold, unfair, esteem, or cruel. It doesn't. It means you recognize that access to your inner world is earned, not owed. You're allowed to protect your emotional energy, esteem. You're allowed to decide that not every feeling needs to be translated for someone who has proven they won't honor it. And here's something important: when you stop explaining, esteem, the narcissistic person often becomes more agitated. They may accuse you of shutting down, being distant, or changing. They may push harder, provoke more, or suddenly demand communication, esteem. This is not because they miss connection, it's because they miss control. Your silence, your brevity, your lack of emotional availability disrupts the dynamic they rely on, esteem. And that discomfort can be misread as love or concern. It isn't. Peace is not loud. Peace doesn't argue its case. Peace doesn't need to convince, esteem. Peace is quiet confidence in your own perception. It's the moment you realize, esteem, I don't need you to understand this for it to be true. That realization alone can feel like taking a full breath for the first time in years, esteem. Let's also talk about the grief that comes with this step, because there is grief. You are letting go of the fantasy that one day, if you just say the right thing, esteem, the relationship will become safe. You are mourning the idea of mutuality, and that hurts. But clinging to that fantasy costs you your peace every single day. Letting it go hurts, esteem. But it frees you. When you stop trying to be understood, you start redirecting that energy inward. You start asking yourself better questions. Esteem. Not how do I make them see me, but why am I still seeking validation from someone who repeatedly harms me? That shift is not self-blame, it's self-awareness. And self-awareness is power, esteem. This step sets the foundation for everything else that follows. You cannot detach from drama if you're still trying to explain yourself into safety, esteem. You cannot set boundaries if you believe they'll finally respect you once they understand your reasons, esteem. You cannot expect pushback without collapsing if you're still emotionally invested in their approval. Stopping the need to be understood is the first act of reclaiming your peace, esteem. And it doesn't happen overnight. You'll catch yourself wanting to explain again. You'll draft messages in your head. You'll feel that familiar pull to clarify. When that happens, esteem. Pause and ask yourself one simple question. Has explaining ever brought me lasting peace in this relationship? Not temporary calm, not a short-lived apology. Real, sustained peace. Esteem. The answer is usually very clear. You don't owe your pain a presentation. You don't owe your boundaries a debate. And you don't owe your peace to someone who has shown you again and again, esteem, that they don't know how to hold it. The moment you stop trying to be understood by a narcissistic person is the moment you stop handing them the keys to your inner world, esteem, and that is where your peace begins. Once you stop trying to be understood, something else becomes very clear, and for many people, this realization is unsettling at first, esteem. Your peace is not neutral in this relationship. Your calm, your clarity, your emotional distance are not just personal choices. To a narcissistic person, they are experienced as a threat, esteem. And if you don't understand that, you can end up blaming yourself when the backlash comes. A narcissistic person relies on emotional engagement to regulate their inner world, esteem. They need reactions, confusion, tears, explanations, defensiveness, because those reactions reassure them that they still matter, still have influence, still have access, esteem. When you're distressed, trying to fix things, or working overtime to restore harmony, they feel powerful. When you're calm, grounded, and no longer chasing repair, esteem. Something inside them destabilizes. This is why peace often triggers chaos. People will say, everything was fine until I stopped reacting. Or, as soon as I started setting boundaries, esteem, things got worse. That's not a coincidence. Your emotional steadiness interrupts the dynamic they depend on. It removes the feedback loop that tells them they're in control, esteem. And instead of responding with introspection, a narcissistic person often responds with escalation. They may pick fights out of nowhere. They may accuse you of being cold, detached, esteem, or uncaring. They may suddenly bring up old grievances, rewrite history, or portray themselves as abandoned. None of this is random, esteem. It's an attempt to reinsert themselves into your emotional field, to provoke you back into engagement, to make you explain, defend, reassure, or collapse. And here's where people get confused, esteem. They assume if my calm is making them this upset, maybe I'm doing something wrong. But peace is not aggression. Boundaries are not attacks. Detachment is not cruelty, esteem. The discomfort you're witnessing is not caused by your behavior, it's caused by the loss of access. A narcissistic person often interprets your peace as rejection, esteem. Not because you've rejected them explicitly, but because you've stopped organizing your emotional life around them, esteem. And for someone whose self-worth depends on external validation and dominance, that feels intolerable. So they push, they test, they provoke, esteem. They try to prove that they still matter by getting a reaction. This is why guilt is such a powerful tool in these dynamics. You'll hear things like, esteem, you've changed. You don't care anymore. You're abandoning me. Or, I guess I'm just the bad guy now. These statements are designed to pull you back into emotional labor. Esteem, to make you reassure them, to make you explain yourself, to make you choose their comfort over your peace. Recognizing this pattern is crucial because without that awareness, esteem, you can end up chasing harmony that never lasts. You might think, if I just soften a little, maybe they'll calm down. And for a moment, they might, esteem. But the price of that calm is your self-betrayal. Each time you give up your peace to manage their discomfort, you reinforce the dynamic that your emotional regulation is your responsibility. Esteem. Let's be very clear, your peace is not something you are doing to them. It is something you are doing for yourself. But a narcissistic person doesn't experience it that way, esteem. They experience it as loss of influence. And instead of respecting that, they try to reassert control. This is also why moments of growth on your part are often met with hostility, esteem. You start therapy, you stop engaging in circular arguments, you say no without explaining, you limit contact, and suddenly you're accused of being selfish, brainwashed, esteem, or not the person you used to be. That's true, you're not. You're becoming someone who is no longer available for emotional extraction, esteem. and that is deeply threatening to someone who depends on you as a source of supply. Understanding this helps you stop taking the bait. When the provocations come, you can name them internally, esteem. This isn't about the issue they're raising. This is about my calm. That mental shift alone can protect your nervous system. You stop scrambling to fix something that isn't broken, esteem. You stop engaging in debates that aren't really debates. You stop confusing intensity with intimacy. There's another painful layer here. Many people hope that their peace will inspire change, esteem, that their calm will model maturity, that their boundaries will encourage reflection. In healthy relationships, that can happen. In narcissistic dynamics, it often doesn't. Esteem. Calm doesn't invite growth, it exposes the absence of it. And exposure can lead to defensiveness, not insight. Esteem. This is why you must stop expecting your peace to be celebrated by someone who benefits from your distress. When you let go of that expectation, you stop being surprised by the backlash. Esteem. You prepare for it emotionally, and preparation is what allows you to stay steady instead of reactive. Your peace may also threaten the narrative they've built about you. Esteem. If they've cast you as emotional, unstable, needy, or the problem, your calm contradicts that story. And when a narcissistic person's narrative is threatened, they often double down. Esteem. They may smear you to others. They may provoke you privately while presenting themselves as reasonable publicly. This isn't because you've done something wrong, esteem. It's because your peace undermines their version of reality. Staying grounded in this phase is hard. You may feel isolated, esteem. You may feel misunderstood by people who only see the narcissist's charm. You may feel tempted to explain yourself to everyone just to restore balance, esteem. But this is where the earlier work matters. You don't need to be understood by everyone to be at peace. You need to be aligned with yourself. Peace in these dynamics, esteem, is often lonely before it is liberating. It can feel anticlimactic, quiet, even uncomfortable. But that discomfort is not danger, it's unfamiliarity, esteem. You're learning to live without chaos as your baseline, and your nervous system needs time to adjust. The key is consistency, not dramatic confrontations, not final speeches, just steady, esteem, calm, predictable behavior that doesn't feed the cycle. Over time, this either leads to distance, which can be painful but clarifying, esteem, or it reveals just how invested the other person is in maintaining control. Either way, your peace becomes information. It shows you what's possible, it shows you what isn't, esteem. And it shows you that you don't need to sacrifice your well-being to keep someone else emotionally regulated, esteem. When you truly understand that your peace is a threat to someone who thrives on chaos, you stop trying to negotiate it away. You stop shrinking to make them comfortable, esteem. And you stop mistaking their discomfort for your responsibility. Your peace doesn't need their permission to exist, esteem. And the moment you stop apologizing for it is the moment it becomes unshakable. Once you understand that your peace threatens the dynamic, the next step becomes unavoidable, esteem. You have to learn how to detach from the drama without detaching from reality. And this is where many people get stuck because they confuse detachment with denial, or worse, with weakness, esteem. They think detaching means pretending nothing is happening, excusing bad behavior, or becoming emotionally numb. That's not what this is. Detachment is not about minimizing harm. Esteem, it's about refusing to let chaos run your nervous system. Narcissistic dynamics are fueled by intensity. The arguments go in circles. The conversations escalate quickly. Esteem. Small issues become moral crises. You're pulled into defending yourself against accusations that don't even make sense. And before you realize it, you're emotionally flooded, exhausted, esteem, and questioning your own sanity. Detaching from the drama means stepping out of that storm without pretending the storm doesn't exist. Reality stays intact. You still see the manipulation, esteem. You still recognize the gaslighting. You still notice the disrespect. But you stop responding as if every provocation requires your emotional presence, esteem. You stop showing up to every fight you're invited to. And that choice alone can feel radical when you've been trained to believe that engagement equals care, esteem. Many people were conditioned to think that if you don't react, you're being passive or complicit. In healthy relationships, silence can be harmful. In narcissistic ones, esteem, constant engagement is what causes the harm. Detachment becomes a form of protection. It's the decision to say, I see what's happening, and I'm not going to let it hijack me, esteem. This is often where guilt shows up. You may feel like you're being cold. You may worry that you're abandoning the relationship. You may fear being seen as the bad person, esteem. But those fears are part of the conditioning. You were trained to manage someone else's emotions at the expense of your own. Detachment breaks that training, esteem. Let's be clear about what drama looks like in these dynamics. It's not just yelling or conflict. Drama is the constant urgency. The feeling that everything needs to be addressed right now. Esteem. The pressure to resolve, clarify, explain, or defend at all times. Drama keeps you reactive, it keeps you tired. And most importantly, it keeps you accessible. Esteem. Detaching from drama means slowing everything down. You don't respond immediately. You don't correct every distortion. You don't chase every accusation. You let silence do some of the work. Esteem. And silence in these relationships is powerful. Not as punishment, but as boundary. You'll notice that when you stop reacting, the other person may escalate. They may raise their voice. Esteem. They may say something outrageous just to get a response. They may accuse you of not caring or shutting down. This is the test. They're checking to see if the old buttons still work. Esteem. Detachment means recognizing the test and refusing to participate. This is not about winning, it's about opting out. You are no longer trying to prove your innocence or your goodness. Esteem. You're no longer trying to be seen accurately by someone who benefits from misrepresenting you. You're choosing peace over performance. And here's something important, esteem. Detachment doesn't mean you stop having feelings. It means you stop processing those feelings in the presence of someone who weaponizes them. You take your emotional life elsewhere, esteem, to therapy, to trusted people, to your own reflective space. You stop offering your rawness to someone who uses it against you. Reality also means acknowledging that you may never get closure, esteem. You may never get a clean resolution. Narcissistic dynamics rarely end with mutual understanding. Detachment helps you tolerate that ambiguity, esteem. You stop waiting for the perfect conversation that will make everything make sense. You accept that clarity may come without their participation, esteem. This is especially hard for people who value communication, who believe in talking things through, who pride themselves on empathy and insight, esteem. Detachment can feel like a betrayal of those values. But it's not. It's still those things, you're just no longer extending them into a space where they cause harm, esteem. There's also a physiological component to this. Drama activates your stress response. Your body becomes accustomed to cortisol, adrenaline, hypervigilance, esteem. Detachment allows your nervous system to settle. And when it does, you may feel strange at first. Calm can feel empty when you've lived in chaos. You may even miss the intensity, esteem. That doesn't mean it was healthy. It means it was familiar. Over time, detachment creates clarity. When you're not emotionally flooded, you see patterns more clearly, esteem. You notice how predictable the cycles are. You recognize the triggers and the scripts. That clarity helps you make better decisions, not in the heat of the moment, but from a grounded place, esteem. You also start to see how much energy you were giving away, how much of your day was consumed by rumination, anticipation, and recovery. Detachment gives that energy back to you, esteem. And with it comes choice. You can choose when to engage. You can choose when to walk away. You can choose what matters. This step often changes the dynamic dramatically, esteem. Either the narcissistic person intensifies their efforts to pull you back in, or they lose interest when the drama dries up. Both outcomes provide information, esteem. Neither requires you to sacrifice your peace. What matters is that you stay anchored in reality. You don't romanticize the relationship. You don't rewrite history, esteem. You don't pretend things are fine when they're not. You simply stop letting dysfunction dictate your emotional state. Detachment is not indifference. It's discernment. It's the ability to say, esteem, I see this clearly, and I choose not to participate. And that choice is one of the most powerful tools you have. When you detach from the drama but stay grounded in reality, esteem, you stop being pulled into the storm, and that's when peace stops being fragile and starts becoming yours to keep. Once you've stopped trying to be understood, esteem, recognize that your peace threatens the dynamic, and learn to detach from the drama without losing touch with reality. The next step becomes unavoidable boundaries, esteem. And this is where many people feel both hopeful and deeply disappointed at the same time. Because we're often taught that if we set boundaries clearly and kindly enough, esteem, the other person will respect them. In narcissistic relationships, that expectation is where peace quietly collapses. Boundaries are not a negotiation. They are not a request for agreement, esteem. And they are not a teaching tool. A boundary is a line you draw to protect your nervous system, your time, and your sense of self-esteem. The mistake many people make is believing that the success of a boundary depends on the narcissistic person's understanding or approval. It doesn't. It depends on your consistency, esteem. You can explain a boundary perfectly and still be ignored. You can deliver it calmly and still be mocked. You can state it with compassion and still be accused of being cruel, esteem. That doesn't mean the boundary is wrong. It means you're dealing with someone who experiences limits as a threat rather than a form of mutual respect, esteem. A narcissistic person often hears a boundary as criticism or rejection or abandonment, and instead of reflecting, they push back. They argue the details. They challenge your reasons, esteem. They demand exceptions. They test whether you're serious. This is why people say, I set a boundary, and it made things worse. What actually happened is that the boundary exposed the dynamic, esteem. Many people also misunderstand what a boundary is. They think it's a statement meant to change the other person's behavior. Esteem. I need you to stop yelling. I need you to respect my time. I need you to be honest. Those are reasonable requests, esteem. But they are not boundaries unless you're prepared to act if they're ignored. A boundary is about what you will do, not what the other person should do. This is where the discomfort shows up, esteem, because enforcing boundaries often leads to consequences you didn't want. Distance, confluence, accusations, loss. And so people soften, they over-explain, they negotiate. Esteem, they give one more chance. And in doing so, they teach the narcissistic person that boundaries are flexible if enough pressure is applied. Enforcing a boundary is not about being harsh, esteem. It's about being predictable, calm, steady. You don't threaten, you don't lecture, you don't plead. You simply follow through. If someone continues to disrespect your time, esteem, you end the conversation. If someone raises their voice, you leave the room. If someone violates your privacy, you reduce access. The action is the boundary, esteem. This is especially hard for people who were conditioned to be accommodating, who learned that love means endurance, who were praised for being patient, forgiving, understanding, esteem. Boundaries can feel selfish in that context, but protecting yourself is not selfish, it's necessary. And it's not your job to manage someone else's reaction to your limits, esteem. You may never receive acknowledgement. You may never hear, I understand why you need this. In fact, you may hear the opposite. You may be accused of being controlling, dramatic, esteem, or unreasonable. This is projection. A narcissistic person often frames your boundaries as the very behaviors they're engaging in, esteem. That distortion can be disorienting if you're still seeking their validation. This is why earlier steps matter so much. If you're still trying to be understood, esteem, boundaries will feel unbearable. If you're still taking their discomfort personally, boundaries will feel cruel. But once you understand the dynamic, esteem, boundaries become an act of self-respect rather than an act of war. It's also important to let go of the idea that boundaries will fix the relationship. They won't. They clarify it, esteem. They show you what's possible and what isn't. They reveal whether there's any capacity for mutuality, and often they reveal that peace requires distance, esteem. Some people worry that setting boundaries means becoming rigid or closed off. In reality, boundaries create the conditions for authentic connection, esteem. They allow you to show up without resentment. They prevent emotional burnout. And in narcissistic dynamics, they are often the only thing standing between you and total depletion, esteem. There's also grief here. You're acknowledging that the relationship may never be safe in the way you hoped, that your needs may never be prioritized, esteem, that you may have to choose yourself in ways that disappoint others. That grief is real. But ignoring it doesn't make it go away, it just prolongs the harm. Boundaries will be tested, esteem, repeatedly, especially if you've never had them before. Each test is an opportunity to reinforce your commitment to yourself. You don't need to escalate. You don't need to justify. Esteem, you just need to be consistent. And consistency is what changes you, even if it doesn't change them. Over time, something shifts. You trust yourself more. You stop explaining, esteem. You stop waiting for permission. You stop feeling responsible for other people's emotions. And that internal shift is where peace becomes sustainable, esteem. Boundaries without expectation of respect may sound bleak, but they're actually freeing. You stop hoping someone else will save you. You become the one who protects your space, esteem. And that protection allows you to breathe again. A boundary doesn't require agreement, it requires courage and the willingness to choose your well-being even when no one applauds it, esteem. After you stop explaining, recognize that your peace threatens the dynamic, detach from the drama, and begin setting boundaries without expecting respect. Something very predictable happens, esteem. The system reacts, and this is the part people rarely prepare you for. You think boundaries will bring relief, and eventually they do, but first, they often bring pushback. Intense pushback, esteem. And if you don't understand what that pushback means, it can pull you right back into the cycle you were trying to escape. When a narcissistic person senses that they're losing access to you, esteem, they don't usually step back gracefully. They escalate, not because you're wrong, not because you're cruel, but because the old methods are no longer working. The volume goes up, esteem. The tactics change. And suddenly you may feel like everything is unraveling, even though you're doing the healthiest thing you've ever done. This is where many people panic and assume, esteem, I've made a mistake. They think, if things are getting worse, my boundaries must be too harsh, or maybe I went too far. But escalation is not evidence that your boundary is wrong, esteem. It's often evidence that it's finally being taken seriously. Pushback can take many forms. It might look like rage, angry outbursts, accusations, threats, or intimidation. Esteem. It might look like victimhood, tears, despair, sudden claims of illness, trauma, or abandonment. It might look like charm, apologies, promises, declarations of change. Esteem. Or a sudden version of the person you've been waiting to see for years. And it might look like punishment, silent treatment, withdrawal, withholding affection, or smear campaigns. Esteem. All of these have one goal: to destabilize you enough that you abandon your boundary and return to the old dynamic. This is why it's so important not to romanticize the pushback. Esteem. People often say they're acting this way because they're hurting. That may be true, but pain does not justify manipulation. The behavior is not a sign of vulnerability. Esteem. It's a sign of desperation to regain control. One of the most confusing forms of pushback is the sudden shift into victim mode. You set a boundary, esteem, and suddenly you're accused of being heartless. You're told you've changed, you're reminded of everything they've done for you. And if you have empathy, esteem, and most people in these relationships do, you feel pulled to fix it. You think, I don't want to hurt them. And just like that, the focus shifts back to their feelings, esteem, and your boundary begins to erode. This is not accidental. Narcissistic dynamics often rely on your empathy to override your self-protection, esteem. The moment you start prioritizing their distress over your well-being, the boundary loses its power. That doesn't make you weak, it makes you human, esteem. But awareness is what keeps you from being pulled back in. Another form of pushback is escalation of blame. Suddenly, you're accused of being abusive, controlling, or selfish. Esteem. Your calm is reframed as coldness. Your boundaries are reframed as ultimatums. Your detachment is reframed as cruelty. This inversion can be deeply destabilizing, esteem, especially if you already struggle with self-doubt. This is where you must anchor yourself in reality, not rhetoric. Ask yourself, did I clearly state my limit? Esteem. Did I follow through without aggression? Did I protect myself without trying to harm them? If the answer is yes, then the accusations are noise. Painful noise, but noise nonetheless. Esteem. Pushback can also come in the form of testing small violations. Esteem. Just this once. You're overreacting. Why are you making such a big deal out of this? These tests are designed to see if you'll bend. If you do, the testing continues. If you don't, esteem, the dynamic shifts. And here's the part that many people don't want to hear. Peace often looks like loneliness before it looks like freedom. When you stop engaging, when you stop rescuing, esteem, when you stop absorbing emotional chaos, there can be a void. The relationship may grow quieter. Distance may increase, and that quiet can feel uncomfortable if chaos was your normal, esteem. This is where people confuse peace with emptiness. They think something is wrong because there's no intensity. But intensity is not connection, it's stimulation, esteem. And stimulation is often mistaken for love in these dynamics. Pushback is also where you see whether the relationship can survive without control. In many cases, it can't, esteem. And that realization brings grief, not because you failed, but because you're finally seeing the relationship clearly. You may also face pushback from others, friends, family, esteem, colleagues who don't see the full picture. They may encourage you to be the bigger person, to keep the peace, to let it go. These messages often come from discomfort with conflict, esteem, not from understanding the dynamic. And if you listen to them without discernment, you may end up abandoning yourself to make others comfortable, esteem. Expecting pushback means you stop being surprised by it. You don't personalize it. You don't interpret it as proof that you're doing something wrong. You see it as part of the process, esteem, a predictable reaction to change. And here's something crucial: pushback is temporary if you're consistent. The intensity may spike, esteem, but it cannot sustain itself indefinitely without your participation. What sustains the cycle is your re-engagement, your explanations, your apologies, your emotional labor. When that stops, esteem, the system has to adapt. This doesn't mean it becomes healthy. It means it becomes clearer. You also learn something important about yourself during this phase, esteem. You learn that you can tolerate discomfort without self-betrayal. You learn that you don't need immediate relief to survive. You learn that your peace is not fragile, esteem. It just needed protection. This phase requires grounding, support. Reminders of why you're doing this. It's not about punishment. It's not about revenge, esteem. It's about reclaiming your life from a dynamic that thrived on your exhaustion. When the pushback comes, and it will, pause before responding. Ask yourself, esteem, is this an invitation back into the cycle or an opportunity to stay aligned with myself? That question alone can change everything. Because once you stop letting pushback fool you, esteem, you stop mistaking resistance for failure, and that's when your peace stops being conditional and starts becoming permanent. After all the boundaries, the detachment, the pushback, esteem, and the grief, there is a final and often overlooked step: rebuilding an inner world where the narcissistic person has no access. This is not about winning. It's not about proving anything. Esteem. It's about creating a life that is emotionally anchored inside you rather than organized around someone else's reactions. Esteem. And this is where peace stops being something you defend and starts being something you live. For a long time, your internal landscape may have been crowded. Their moods dictated your day. Esteem, their tone shaped your nervous system. Their approval or disapproval quietly decided whether you felt safe or anxious. Even when they weren't physically present, esteem. They were psychologically present. Their voice lived in your head. Their expectations shaped your choices. Rebuilding your inner world means evicting that presence, gently but firmly. Esteem. This process doesn't happen through confrontation. It happens through redirection. You begin to notice where your attention goes, how often you're checking in on how they feel, esteem, what they might think or how they'll react, and then slowly you start checking in with yourself instead. What do I need right now? What feels grounding, esteem? What restores me rather than drains me? At first, this can feel unfamiliar, even uncomfortable. Many people in narcissistic dynamics lose touch with their preferences, their instincts, esteem, and their desires. They've spent so long anticipating someone else that their own inner signals feel faint. Rebuilding means listening again, esteem. It means allowing yourself to want things without justification, to rest without guilt, to enjoy without waiting for permission. A critical part of this is reconnecting with your body, esteem. Narcissistic relationships often live in the head, rumination, overthinking, rehearsing conversations, scanning for danger. The body, meanwhile, holds the stress, esteem. Rebuilding your inner world involves teaching your nervous system that it is safe to slow down. This might look like movement, breath, routine, esteem, or simply moments of quiet that aren't filled with analysis. Peace is as much physiological as it is psychological. You also begin to rebuild your sense of identity, esteem. Not the version of you that was always reacting, accommodating, or managing someone else's emotions, but the version that existed before, or perhaps never had the space to exist at all, esteem. You explore what matters to you. What values guide you when no one is watching? What kind of relationships feel reciprocal rather than consuming? This often involves grief, esteem. You may grieve lost time, lost versions of yourself, lost hopes for what the relationship could have been. That grief is not a setback, it's a sign of honesty, esteem. Avoiding it keeps you tethered to the past. Moving through it frees you to build something new. Another essential part of this inner rebuilding is choosing where you place your trust, esteem. Narcissistic dynamics often distort your perception. You may doubt your judgment. You may second-guess your reactions. Rebuilding means slowly restoring trust in yourself, esteem. You reflect on what you noticed, what you felt, what you endured, and you allow those experiences to inform your boundaries and choices going forward without turning them into armor. Esteem, support matters here. Safe people. People who don't rush you, who don't minimize, who don't demand performance or positivity. Connection that feels calm rather than intense. Esteem. Being witnessed without being interrogated. These relationships help retrain your nervous system. They remind you that connection doesn't have to hurt to be real. Esteem. You'll also notice something subtle but powerful as you rebuild. Your emotional reactions change. Things that once triggered you no longer land the same way. You're less reactive. Esteem. Not because you're numb, but because your center of gravity has shifted inward. Their behavior becomes information rather than a verdict on your worth, esteem. This is where the narcissistic person truly loses power, not because you confronted them, but because they no longer occupy prime real estate in your inner world, esteem. Their approval is no longer the currency of your self-esteem. Their disapproval no longer defines your reality. You are no longer living in response mode, esteem. And this is why peace becomes durable here. It's not dependent on distance alone. It's not dependent on silence or compliance. It's rooted in self-connection. Even if the person reappears, esteem, even if they attempt to provoke or reinsert themselves, the access point is gone. Rebuilding your inner world also means learning to enjoy your own company, to tolerate quiet, esteem, to experience pleasure without adrenaline, to find meaning in routines, creativity, service, or growth. These are not distractions, they are anchors, esteem. They make your life fuller in ways that chaos never could. There may still be moments of doubt, moments when old patterns whisper, when you wonder if you were too harsh, too sensitive, esteem, too much. When that happens, return to the present, to your breath, to the reality of how your body feels now compared to before. Peace leaves evidence. This final step is not dramatic, esteem. It's not loud, it's not something others may even notice. But it's profound because it means you are no longer organizing your life around someone who thrived on your instability, esteem. You didn't just stop a narcissist from destroying your peace, you built a life where they no longer have the power to reach it.